This week, I wanted to go a little more in depth into Plato's Allegory of the Cave from the Republic. This allegory is probably one of the more prominent, popular examples of philosophy. If you've heard of any philosophy before, Plato's Allegory of the Cave is quite possibly one of the things that you've heard of. As the book mentioned, it deals with almost all of the branches of philosophy: metaphysics, the nature of reality, ethics, how should we treat other people, and epistemology, the theory of knowledge. A lot of this Allegory of the Cave revolve around Plato's ideal forms, and I'm going to explain a little more what he means by ideal forms. Um, but in order to do that, we're going to think about beauty, because Plato believes that beauty is quite possibly the only exception to how ideal forms work. Beauty is one of the few um, intellectual ideas that we can understand actually by just looking around on Earth. So if we think about beauty, we can look around and we can all recognize different beautiful things. So what are some beautiful things that we might recognize? Well, maybe there are flowers, right? Some of us would see flowers as a beautiful thing. Maybe it's sunsets, or maybe it's that song that we're listening to. The point is that we can all look around and see these individual beautiful things. Okay, that's great, but where does that get us? Well, Plato believes that as we think of these individual beautiful things, we need to maybe ask if there's something in common that makes all of these things beautiful. Is there some kind of absolute beauty? And when we start talking about absolute beauty, that's when we get back into this concept of ideal forms. Um, Plato would ask, or perhaps tell us, that there's this ideal form of beauty that exists. And each individual beautiful thing partakes in that form of ideal beauty. So, this is kind of like an essential definition that we talked about with Socrates. Remember when we discussed the chair? We tried to come up with an essential definition of a chair. What is a chair? In the same way that we're talking about beauty, you could possibly talk about the ideal form of a chair. Um, what is a chair? Does each particular chair that exists partake in this ideal form of a chair? That's kind of what Plato is getting at. It's very much related to Socrates' notion of an essential definition of something. What's different for Plato is that, as best we can tell, he really thought these ideal forms existed somewhere out there in the universe. There's never any specification as to where, but they seem to be this real thing for Plato. And for Socrates, that wasn't the case. So Plato is making more of a metaphysical claim than Socrates was. Um, okay, so how do we figure out what beauty is? Well, we look around at all these individual beautiful things, and then possibly we can come up with this idea of ideal beauty. Now, when we start talking about Plato's epistemology, he divides it into two realms: opinion and knowledge. You're at the level of opinion when all you can do is see individual beautiful things. So if you can point at the flower and say, that's a beautiful flower, you're at the level of opinion. You don't reach knowledge until you're able to know beauty itself. What is it? What is beauty? What about beauty holds all of these individual beautiful things together? And as you'll see, Plato believes it's only lovers of wisdom, aka, if you'll remember, philosophers, who are able to reach this knowledge. In order to think this through in a little more depth, we're going to talk about Plato's divided line. This is a system he uses to describe the way he thinks and explains our understanding of the world. You'll see on the left you have opinion, which is the lowest form of understanding, and on the right you have knowledge. Okay. The lowest form of knowledge for Plato is conjecture. And if you think about his allegory of the cave, think here about the shadows that the chained up people are seeing on the walls. This is conjecture, right? How far away are they from true knowledge? They're not even seeing the object itself, right? They're seeing the shadow of a cardboard cutout of this object. And when you think about the nature of fire, think about the shadows it casts, right? The flame is always changing and flickering, and the shadow is constantly moving and changing. This is conjecture. Think back again to the discussion we had the first week when I mentioned South Park and philosophy and how we're a very opinion-centric culture. We believe that you should have an opinion on everything, and sometimes we don't have anything to back this up. That's what we're talking about when it comes to conjecture. And for Plato, this is as far away from knowledge as you can be. Taking a step up from that, we move into belief. Now, interestingly, this is where empirical science falls for Plato. Um, Empirical science, on the other hand, is something that our culture also upholds very strongly, and many take that to be the ultimate form of knowledge. So I just wanted to point out here that for Plato, that type of empirical science still falls in the realm of opinion. It's still not approaching what he would consider knowledge. Um, and again, when we were talking about individual beautiful things, this is where they would fall on the divided line. So you see objects such as animals, trees, manufactured things, as you see here. These are the types of things that would be in the realm of belief. Okay, so if empirical science doesn't lead us to knowledge, what does? Well, understanding is almost there. For Plato, understanding would be theoretical science. So this is science that we can only do through reason. So it would involve a lot of mathematical thought, right? Nothing that we can tangibly put our hands on and test like we can in empirical science. So within math, you get these ideas such as the Pythagorean theorem, or um, a perfect circle, or an ideal square. Those types of things are mathematical, can only be proven through reasoning, not through empirical testing. To get all the way to real knowledge requires the exercise of reason for Plato. This is dialectic thought. It's where we get to his ideal forms of things like beauty, justice, and goodness. I mentioned for Plato that beauty was the only one that we can actually start by looking at things around us. But we can't look around us and see justice or see goodness. We have to use our reason to develop this understanding of these ideal forms. And it's actually even a little bit more complicated than that, right? In order to live a just life or to organize a just state, we have to truly understand justice through the exercise of our reason. And so, in a way, that's not only a metaphysical claim, it's also, in a way, an ethical claim, right? If we're going to be good or treat others justly, as we may be ethically required to do or want to do, we have to first understand justice or goodness. So, in order to live out those acts, we have to get there through knowledge. Let's look at a quick example of why we can't get to these ideal forms typically through our sense impressions here on Earth. Okay, one might tend to think we could create a perfect circle, right? If we were in a classroom, I might take a marker or a piece of chalk and draw a circle on the board. Now, I am by no means an artist, and so my circle really isn't going to be anywhere near perfect. Maybe some of you are pretty good artists, and I could have you come up and draw a circle, and you'd get pretty close to a perfect circle. But if we really got further in on that circle and looked closer at it, we would see it was composed of something, right? Maybe bits of chalk, or if you used a pencil to do on your paper, bits of graphite. And the closer we get, we see that the line formed by that writing utensil is nowhere near perfect, right? If we zoom in really far, we can see that. Okay, so maybe there's limitations to using one of our tools, like a pencil or a marker or a piece of chalk, to draw a perfect circle. But surely, can't we get there through using a computer to generate it? So I've used a computer to generate this circle you see here on your screen. But again, if we zoom in really close on it, what do we see? Well, even the best circles that we can do with computers come down to pixels at some point, and these pixels aren't perfect, right? So every space from the circle is not an equidistance from the center on the outside. And if we can't get that, we can't get to a perfect circle. If you think about Plato's divided line this way, it's really backing up what he says, right? The actual things around us aren't these ideal forms. We can get pretty close to them, right? I mean, when we zoom out, the circle looks pretty good. But really, we can only understand a perfect circle. We can never see it. Hopefully, this is a little more concrete with the idea of a circle. When we get to things like justice and goodness, it's much more complicated, right? Because we can't even come close to drawing justice. We have to work with it completely in the realm of reason or understanding. So for that reason, it's a lot harder to fully understand these concepts, and yet it's important for us in order to lead this ethical life. Okay, let's move a little more directly into Plato's allegory of the cave now. We've already talked about how changing the shadows of things are. But let's focus on what it would be like to come out of the cave, right? So you've been living in a dark cave all your life, not ever even looking at the light, just seeing some shadows. Again, very dim. Think about what it would be like to climb up out of that cave into daylight. What would your senses do? What is your immediate reaction to that? Remember, you've never been into daylight before. It's going to be a painful experience. Think about if you've ever been in a dark room and someone has just flipped on the switch really quickly, right? It hurts your eyes. It's painful. There's a transition period. You're disoriented for a bit. You don't know what's going on around you. Emerging from the cave would be a lot like that, right? There's a pain of seeing the light. Your first instinct is going to be to close your eyes or to go back down in the cave. I think for Plato, knowledge is a lot like this, right? We are comfortable in the realm of opinion, conjecture, belief. Really getting to that state of knowledge when we first attempt to do it is similarly painful. It might disturb some of our long held beliefs, some of the things that we've held near and dear, so to speak. It's only after a period of adjustment that we can really deal with the light of being outside of this allegorical cave. Okay, so then the question of ethics is, now that we've been exposed to this, do we go back down and help others see the light? Is it our duty to help them, or do we just go on our merry way having seen the light? And that's a serious ethical question, and a big part of what we should start thinking about in philosophy, right? Does it matter? Do we need to go back down and help others see the light? There's a really interesting line that makes an allusion to Socrates. Plato writes, "And if anyone tried to free another and lead him up to the light, would they not kill him if they could lay their hands on him?" Think about when we talked about Socrates, right? He was trying to show the light to others, help them understand and see what an essential definition was. And what happened to him? Well, he was put to death, right? That shows you how firmly we're stuck and, in a way, want to be in this cave. When someone else tries to show us the light, we don't want to go willingly. And there's a reason for it. It's painful. Okay, we've talked about these forms and what they mean. For Plato, the important thing is that they're changeless and eternal, these ideal forms. Everything in the world around us changes. It's inconstant, it's flickering in the light of the flame. But these ideal forms that can be known only through reason are changeless and eternal. The normal objects that we do see around us participate in these ideal forms. These forms have characteristics that it gives to the particulars. So the ideal chair gives characteristics to each of the chairs we see around us. Ideal beauty gives the characteristics of beauty to each individual beautiful thing, whether it's a beautiful flower or a beautiful sunset. And the way that we understand these ideal forms is through its essential definition. So, in a way, you can see Plato carrying out the original mission of Socrates. I hope this helps you understand a little bit better how Plato's Allegory of the Cave hits areas of philosophy such as metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. The question I want to leave you with is, if Plato was right about this theory of knowledge, how do we get to this knowledge? How do we obtain it? How do we come to have any knowledge? So, more concretely, let me ask you this. How do we know what justice is? How do we know what goodness is? And as you think through that answer, how do you think that would affect education if we adopted a theory of knowledge like this? Think about it on an individual level, but also on the level of society, right? What would your education look like if this concept of knowledge were correct? What would school be like? What would we learn in the classroom?